At the end of World War II, the world was divided essentially between the United States and Russia. The reason is because essentially at the end of World War II, those were the only two major powers who really hadn't been destroyed. So France, Germany, obviously, the United Kingdom, and other countries had really been ravaged by the war. But as a result of the war, the really only two major powers that came out of it were the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union. But then we know that from two meetings, we have the development of the splitting up of Europe. Basically, what we have at Yalta and then eventually at Potsdam are plans on how to set up a divided Europe. So you have the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, along with the Soviet Union, deciding that Europe will be divided. And we know that the blue countries on this map will be divided into the NATO powers, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, developed in the late 1940s. And then we know that the red countries on this map in the early 1950s will have a response to that, and they will create their own group called the Warsaw Pact. Now, the division of these countries, obviously, first, again, like I said, starts at Yalta, and then obviously concludes at Potsdam, occurs because the Soviet Union believes that they deserve to be paid for their work with the British and the Americans and the French to save Europe from Hitler, while the Allies believe that it is their business to actually pay to give them the work, give them the territory that they want, because essentially they did help us beat Hitler. Now, we know that Germany is divided into East Germany and West Germany. The East German side becoming known as the German Democratic Republic, while the West German side being called the Federal Republic of Germany. We also know that if you look over here, there's a little spot that is divided again, which is Berlin, starting right after World War II. And then with the division of Berlin, Stalin, starting in 1947, 1948, really wants to hurt the Allies in their division of Berlin. So Berlin, even though we know that Germany was divided into East and West, West was divided into three parts, and then Western Berlin was divided into three parts as well, with the British, French, and American sides. Now, because Berlin was in the middle of East Germany, at the heart of East Germany, really, in the Soviet section, the Soviets, Stalin decided that he was going to blockade Berlin to really starve out the Americans, the French, and the British. And in order to do that, he cuts off all of the major roads that lead into Berlin. What essentially has to happen then is the flying in of goods into Berlin, and we call that the Berlin Airlift. And that happens between 1947 and 1948. That occurs, obviously, to bring in supplies that they would have been left without. Because of this occurring between those months, it ultimately winds up that in May of 1948, this can't be kept up any longer because it's not working for Stalin. So the Allies essentially win this mini battle of the Cold War. And then finally, we know that the Berlin Wall is established, at least in Europe, in eastern Berlin, around the western sector. And you see that here. It's built in 1961 to keep Eastern Germans out of West Berlin, because in East Germany, people did not have jobs, did not really have much success, so they were fleeing into the West Berlin, and then flying out of Europe. Okay, so we also know that along with the Berlin Wall, which occurs in 1961, there's also two other major problems that occur in this time period. So we have the Korean Peninsula being divided right after World War II into North and South Korea, and along the line called the 38th parallel. That's just, remember, means the latitude line. The capital of North Korea is set at the city of Pyongyang, while Southern Korea is located, the capital is located at Seoul. These two locations, obviously, there's tensions between them, and the North ultimately does wind up invading the South. And with that invasion, there's also the need for then the South to be defended, beginning the Korean War. After 3 years of fighting, no one really wins, and essentially what has occurred is a ceasefire and armistice. At this armistice, it is decided that a demilitarized zone of 1.25 miles will be established along the border. No guns, military equipment can be located there, still to today. The more troubling one, and the one that probably gets us into more trouble and eventually gets us into greater amounts of issues domestically at home, but also internationally, is the Vietnam War. Beginning in the late 1950s, France takes over the area back from what it once had controlled, and the fight ultimately begins. And we know that France winds up trying to control their former colony because of problems that ultimately start. And essentially, the Vietnam War goes on between southern Vietnam and northern Vietnam. Southern Vietnam being run by Ngo Dinh Dien, while the northern Vietnam being controlled by Ho Chi Minh. Diem becomes more totalitarian as the National Liberation Front begins to fight more and more, and the National Liberation Front eventually moves up to northern Vietnam. In northern Vietnam, they become the Viet Cong Army, and they begin to fight between the North and the South. The South being supported by the United States and the Allies, the North being supported by China and China and the Soviet Union. There we go. So this eventually, obviously, leads to war. War goes on between 1965 and 1973, and ultimately, with the war ending in 1973, fighting still sort of hostilities going on, and by 1975, the North had completely invaded the South, and South Vietnam had now become communist just as much as the North had. So that's how we end really the 1960s into the 1970s. Once Vietnam is over, you really are sort of done with the tensions of World War II, of the Cold War, World War II, I suppose, but really by that I mean the Cold War. And now we are moved into the late Cold War. When we come back on Monday, or when we come back next week, what you're going to see is that we're going to be looking at the development of the world after World War I and the world after World War II, in particular, in colonies. Okay, so one last incident that we really need to talk about here regarding the Cold War, and particularly the United States and Soviet Union, is the incidences in Cuba, starting first with the Bay of Pigs incidents in 1961 and then the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So in terms of the Bay of Pigs, what ultimately happens is that when Fidel Castro becomes a leader in 1959 of Cuba, there are anti-Cuba forces that are dominating, or at least trying to fight against Fidel. And then as the fighting continues, Fidel wins. These Cuban rebels have to flee to Guatemala. And then the United States, with the support of the CIA, help backing up these Cuban refugees and to ultimately fight against Fidel. So they, in 1961, invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, and John F. Kennedy, the new president, is supposed to come and back up them with air support, other support. Ultimately, he decides he's not going to send in the support, and these Guatemalan CIA-trained soldiers wind up getting destroyed. Many of them get captured and killed. The second incident that we need to discuss is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. In this event, what occurs is a closer connection is emerging between Fidel Castro and the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, and in order to sort of solidify the deal, Fidel Castro agrees to allow Stalin to put some missiles into Cuba, and there are 3 locations for that. An American U-2 spy plane wind up finding these different nuclear sites, and then becomes a standoff 13 days in October of 1962. In these 13 days, the world is really close to nuclear war. There's heated moments where we can't, we don't really know what's going to happen. And it's particularly with the United States being so close to Cuba, only roughly 90 miles, the threat really is very severe that, if the Soviet Union wants to send weapons into North America, that's certainly a possibility. After these 13 days, sort of towards the end of them, what ultimately winds up happening is the United States and the Soviet Union agree that they will both remove nuclear weapons from one place. So the Soviet Union agrees they're going to remove their weapons from Cuba, while the United States is going to remove their weapons from Turkey. And that really ends the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really was a tense 13 days of disagreement between the two sides.